Thank you, Hugh. Let's see here. Last year, we had quite a lot of time for discussion, and I'll go through the presentation, but I'm really open to having a lot of discussion and questions afterwards, and so we'll try to leave time for that. I think we have plenty of time. So as Hugh said, this is the 13th time I've been up here. I went back and looked at my records, and I've been basically involved with the shellfish industry pretty much on markets since 1997. I'm still doing the stuff that we do up in Alaska with the crab arbitration pricing. And we are changing our name to seafoodnews.com, and we're going to sort of retire the use of seafood.com. So this is just a sort of summary, which to me is interesting here in the sense that we have snow crab prices now for 2 years, 16 and 17, above the price of Dungeness. Those are snow crab sections and Dungeness clusters. And that's highly unusual because most people value Dungeness as a more valuable crab product, particularly as a section. And a lot of years, even the whole cook prices are higher than snow crab. So something's really happened here in the market, and that's what we're going to talk about. This is just the Dungeness cluster pricing, and you can see that it's been drifting down from the supply shock of 2014-15, and it's been pretty stable over the last 6 or 7 months. So last year, I've been talking about this for a couple of years because this is shown up on this chart. This is shellfish volatility. So if you look at, I think there's some, okay, I have the figures on another slide, but just look at these prices go up and come down. So we have here lobster meat goes up, comes down. We have earlier crab meat, shrimp go up and come down. And now we have snow crab, which is up 50 or 60% in terms of its price as opposed to what it had been trading at a couple of years ago. And so I'm pretty confident that the snow crab market is going to see some type of correction. It could be pretty mild because there's some other factors involved. But certainly if it follows these trajectories, we should expect something to happen. This is a 25-year price history of snow crab, and these are the last 2 years. And so for a long time, it was very standard. The crab got too expensive, and the market rebelled, and prices fell a lot. And then since 2012, really, prices shot up, and they've been staying in a much higher range. And part of that is because, not just for snow crab, but for all shell crab products, Dungeness, king crab, et cetera, there's been a really strong demand in the U.S. The retailers like to have that product in the case. The restaurants, casinos, buffets, all like to use that product. So what we're seeing here is pretty unprecedented. And I think that it means that we're never going to go back to these levels, at least in the foreseeable future, in my opinion. The days of, $3 and $4 snow crab sections, I think, are history. And it's helpful to think about why that is. It's because we got a wild product. There's no farmed crab to compete with it. And because we have more markets and more people who are interested in it, whether it's China, which is buying more live crab, whether it's the Japanese who've kind of reacquired some of their appetite for snow crab, or the U.S. Retailers and food service who want to buy it. So basically, we got a situation where more people are trying to buy what's essentially a limited wild resource. And that is a recipe for a long-term increase in the value of these crab products. And There's something on the horizon in Canada which is going to continue this trend, because the Canadians had a 20% tariff on their crab going into Europe. And Europe has never been a big market for snow crab. And with the elimination of this 20% tariff, the Canadians are looking at opening up the European market as another place where they're going to sell. They already sell a lot of lobsters there. So they're looking to develop some of that market for snow crab. So that's a further expansion. And so what that means overall is that the demand is going to be there to support these higher valuations. So that's the reason I don't think we're ever going back to this period. We're going to talk about sort of retail and food service. And this is very interesting because as this price of crab has gone up, the retail promotions have gone down. So these are the retail promotions. This is king crab, snow crab, and Dungeness. And this year, since December, January, we've been lower in terms of retail promotions than the prior year or the year before that. But if you look at the trends, Dungeness is increasing in its retail promotions. And retail is basically fresh whole cooks, frozen whole cooks, and clusters and sections. And so what happened this year, since, let's see, January is here, June, August, July, August, September, October, is that the trend for Dungeness promotions has been increasing. And Dungeness promotions are higher than they were last year. Whereas the trend for, I think this is king crab promotion. Oh, let me just check this. I think that's whole, yeah. The top line is whole cooks. And the bottom line, the top line is snow crab. The middle line is king crab. And the bottom line is Dungeness. But the other two have been declining. The retailers have been backing away due to their high pricing. And this one shows the whole cooks. It's a different scale on the left. This is the number of stores in a given month that are running sales promotions. And so you can see how whole cooks really follows the season. This is January of 2017. Big increase in whole cook promotions. And clusters, there was not as dramatic at the beginning, but over time, as the retailers sort of reduced their reliance on snow crab, given the pricing, they moved into Dungeness clusters. And that has definitely been one of the factors that's supporting the market. So if we look at retail seafood overall, the first thing is that the average price of seafood went up. This is all stuff, not just crab. So the average price went up after falling for a couple of years. And as what usually happens, the volume in this case goes down. So we have a lower volume of salmon, lower volume of fresh and frozen fillets, shellfish, which includes crab, lower volume. Shrimp is about the same. So almost just one type of shrimp has increased, and almost everything else has declined. So we're seeing lower volumes of seafood being sold overall through retail promotions, but we're seeing increases in Dungeness crab. And I guess if there's one theme today, it's that Dungeness crab is kind of bucking some of these trends that we see going on in the rest of the seafood industry. So if we look at retail summary, I think that Dungeness is very well positioned as a successful retail item for this coming year, so long as the volume is there to support it. In order to expand into these markets and take away market share from snow crab, Dungeness has to have the coast-wide volume to support that. And we certainly had that volume last year. I think we're about 58 million pounds in July or something like that. It's 50. And so if that volume is there, again, with all three states, there's a lot of opportunity to sell it in an expanded market range. But if the volume contracts, prices will obviously go up, but it also becomes more of a West Coast specialty product. It's a lot harder to get the Red Lobsters or the Publix supermarket in Florida, or for people like Kroger or East Coast supermarkets to handle Dungeness. Right now, there's snow crab prices are very high. I'm not going to go into that in great detail till later, but there's a lot of reasons why snow crab prices won't decline again until April or May of next year at the earliest. This relationship, this backwards relationship between snow crab and Dungeness prices, where it's upside down, Dungeness is supposed to be higher, but right now snow crab is higher, that's going to change. And that's one of the reasons why I think we might see higher prices for Dungeness next year. I don't think that relationship is, Dungeness is a higher value crab, and I think it's going to be reflected in the market. The domoic acid, it could have an impact in terms of the mix between whole cooks and sections. Because if the retailers feel more comfortable wanting eviscerated crab, they're more likely to ask for sections instead of their normal whole cooks. I mean, they're very risk averse. That's really critical. And it's not so much that the domoic acid inspections and everything isn't good, it is. But the one thing that these retail brands and the big food service chains are adverse to is something happening in their store or on their watch because they took a risk that they didn't have to take. And so if they feel they can do a program on clusters versus a program on whole cooks, that's one factor that might shift them towards clusters. Overall, it's been a pretty good year for seafood in 2017 because the U.S. economy has continued to expand. We've seen, even though we've seen a decline in food service traffic, food service is still the main driver of strong demand. And there's an interesting dynamic about this food service traffic problem, which I'll get into in just a minute. The retailers have cut back on the more expensive items like salmon. These disruptions, which last month I thought that they would have some restaurant impact. I mean, in Florida and Texas, you had a significant impact on restaurants from the hurricanes, but I don't know the impact in California, but it seems to be that things have recovered from that. So there's a general good feeling about the economy, but people are thinking they're not as confident as they were. And so there's always a possibility that might change in the future. The restaurants are really facing a lot of trouble. In the South, the storms hurt restaurant sales. But even without that impact, same-store sales are historically low. And the restaurant industry compares sales at a location that's been open at least a year with what it was prior. And those have declined for 13 of the last 16 months. And one of the analysts was saying that the restaurant industry is facing its worst period since 2009, which, if you all remember, was terrible for everybody. But this isn't really hurting the seafood industry because it seems that the main reason why the restaurant industry is facing all of this trouble is because they built too many restaurants. And so they built out so many restaurants that they're all cannibalizing each other for customers. And so the same volumes of seafood are going into the food service market, but they're just going to a greater number of restaurants. But from the restaurant operators' viewpoint, their individual restaurants are reporting terrible numbers because they're declining traffic because they've overbuilt. And so there's going to have to be some kind of a consolidation or shakeout in terms of unit locations. So you have a company like Joe's Crab Shack, which went through a bankruptcy and then was acquired by another company. And the first thing they did was they cut 30 or 40 of those locations. So this coming year, the amount of crab going into Joe's Crab Shack is going to be a fraction, 30 or 40% of what it was in prior years. So the other important thing about this food service is that when they get financial pressure, they are less willing to pay for high-priced products. And so they've certainly seen a price spike in snow crab, and this is really causing people to cut back. So for example, Gulf Coast casinos in Mississippi and Alabama, and a lot of the native-run casinos around the country, snow crab is like a big item. On the Gulf Coast, they've strongly cut that back, so they're not even serving crab except for weekends, and they're adding price increases to boot. But the thing that really made me notice this is Red Lobster. This is the Red Lobster Crab Fest promotional picture, and there's Dungeness crab sitting right in the middle. And Red Lobster made a significant turn away from snow crab this year. And in their Crab Fest, they gave billing to Dungeness, to snow crab, and king crab, and it was kind of an effort on their part to increase the usage of Dungeness and decrease the usage of snow crab. So I think that Dungeness has the good food service opportunity going into 2018 because places like Red Lobster that have expanded the usage of Dungeness have introduced it to more customers, and Red Lobster with their advertising is often a bellwether for other restaurant companies. So when they see Red Lobster advertising Dungeness crab, for example, there's a lot of other companies that will kind of follow suit and look for ways to bring Dungeness on the menu if it's obtainable, if they can do so. It's competitive in terms of price for casual dining, buffets, and casinos. And the only downside in all of this is the hesitation that somebody has introducing a new product to an area. It's a no-brainer for people who are already familiar with Dungeness. But when you go into a restaurant in an area that Dungeness is not the traditional crab, they do have to ask themselves, is this price advantage going to last? Is it significant enough? I'm going to have to put in the extra effort to sell this on my menu. So it's not 100% cost-free. For 2018, if you look on the negative side, the economists are, that we've had a very, very long expansion, and the Fed is now raising interest rates. And at some point, some economists think we're going to fall into a recession, or there could be something that happens elsewhere in the world that pushes that. And of course, I'm not shy about my feelings. Trump is adding a lot of instability economically. I don't think we've seen much ramifications yet, but there's no telling when something might happen because of that. The export market's important for Dungeness. These live exports for China have become a significant factor over the years. This year, there's been a lot of small disruptions of shipments when the Chinese testing or the Canadians in Vancouver have had procedures that have led to temporary stoppages on things like geoduck and Dungeness. Most of those have gotten resolved, and there's a competition among entry points in China right now in the customs office. And so, for example, we ran a little article not that long ago. I think it was from Qingdao or something, and the customs office in Qingdao was bragging how they'd cleared a shipment of Dungeness in 40 minutes. And the various Chinese custom and border processes, if it's legitimate, if it's not a gray market or black market type of thing, if it's legitimate, they are trying to speed up their processes, and it's sort of helping the volume. Um,
John,
yes.
that article you were talking about, is that the one where they were calling Dungeness the treasure crab?
It could be. I don't remember you.
That was one I
Okay.
found that interesting. They call it the treasure crab.
Treasure crab, okay. These are live exports to China. This is multiple years. And what we see here is that in 2017, this is January, we had a big spike for the Chinese New Year. And since then, these are U.S. direct exports to China. Since then, it's fallen off month by month. It's been a lot less. But some of that product has gone to Canada, and there's a lot of that West Coast Dungeness live product goes to BC, and then is shipped out because of the air connections from Vancouver to various parts. And so, if you look at this, you see that the shipments from Canada to Canada were much higher in every single month than last year. And my feeling is that that was the pathway for a lot of crab going to China this year. And if you look at the Chinese, here's a graph of BC exports, and this is the U.S. direct exports. That's a good one. And this is the U.S. direct exports, and this is the BC exports. And you can see that the Canadians made up some of that difference, and that the overall volume of what's going into China is stable, I think, at the moment. I want to talk a little bit about what's driving this, because there's just no question that China is becoming a more and more important market for shellfish, and things like lobster, like crab. The reason is that e-commerce is really driving that. If you think back to how Dungeness first got into China, it was first going into these high-end hotels, and sort of there was a very expensive restaurant trade. It was aimed at rich Chinese and foreign nationals and people like that. And then it kind of, then the low prices of lobster in particular in 2012, it kind of expanded out of that into mid-level restaurants, and there was a luxury crackdown where the government forbid people to spend money on banquets, and so it forced the dealers of these seafood products to sell them to different types of restaurants. And it became much more of a mass market idea. And so then the e-commerce boom kind of popularized that, so anybody in China who are very status conscious, you can buy this online and serve it to your own family. So that has been driving just a tremendous volume of product. And there is e-commerce company called G-Fresh, which actually specializes in Dungeness and geoduck. G-Fresh doesn't deal with consumers, they deal directly with restaurants and wholesalers, but they handle the import process, they handle the distribution, and then they return the money back to the exporter. Alibaba, in China, the e-commerce sites like JD.com and others are very huge companies. They're like Amazon. They're very integrated. And Alibaba has started building out these stores which are designed to sell fresh and live seafood, which you can also buy online. And the stores are called Hema. This is the name of it. And they don't have cash registers. Everything is done on your phone. And you can order, if you want to get like Dungeness, you can order it delivered to your house. You can order it cooked and delivered to your house. You can have it cooked and picked up in the store. You can go to the store and browse, and then you put your order on your phone and you just pick it up and walk out. And it's like a sort of seamless experience. And what they're trying to do here is make it a social experience so that people want to share what they're buying and what they're experiencing with these kinds of interesting foods. And I just think that this has a tremendous potential in China. So I think that the ability of China to draw in more imports is going to grow and grow unless there's some kind of trade disruption or something. So all in all, I think it was a banner year. We know it was a banner year for the crab fishery. It was a good year for other seafood. Salmon held up very well until lately. West Coast landings totaled 58 million pounds. Oregon saw a record landed value. California value increased a lot over their 2016. So we had a good year. And I think that Dungeness, last year, I think, or maybe it was the year before, a few people told me I always came here and talked about doom and gloom and all the risk in markets and so forth. Well, those risks haven't really gone away, but as near as I can tell, Dungeness should be in a very favorable position for 2018. The reasons: other crab products, especially snow crab, are still at record prices. The wholesale prices for Dungeness have declined. We've sort of gotten over that price hump that happened in 2014 when there was that big supply shock. So the pricing of Dungeness in the market today is very reasonable. And when you have a reasonable price level in the eyes of your customers, they're inclined to order more, and you have an expansion in what they're willing to use. And that often ends up pushing up the price. Red king crab, very short supply, but even though it's short supply, their prices are coming down. Snow crab prices are going to stay high over this $8 level right up until the new season starts in Canada in April or May. So the Alaska production is being cut back from like 21 to maybe 19 million pounds. And the Alaska prices might come down a little bit, but very little of that Alaska snow crab kind of gets out into the market. It's sort of all spoken for, and most of the companies use it as leverage with particular customers. So in January and February, I think that snow crab prices are going to still be considerably higher than the current price levels of Dungeness, and that leaves room for Dungeness prices to go up a little bit, in my opinion. So now let's look at some of the more specific issues about Dungeness. The timing of the season. Will volume be similar or above last year? That's critical, and Hugh says there's some talk of volume being significantly less. If that's the case, obviously the prices are going to react, and we won't be able to take advantage of these new market opportunities. The domoic acid issue is something that can affect customers and buyers. The inventory situation, to my knowledge, is fairly good. I'm not aware of people sitting on big chunks of unsold frozen crab inventory. It doesn't mean that the inventories at the customer level, which we don't have any insight into, but these things can change. Even when customers have inventory, it changes, and it changed, for example, with cold water shrimp. What happened last June was that all the customers were saying, no, we're backed up. We know that shrimp is going to be very short, but doesn't matter, we don't want to buy any. And so the prices look like they were going down. And then all of a sudden, things kind of reversed themselves. And by August, prices of cold water shrimp had shot up again back to where they were 9 or 10 months ago. And so this idea that the inventory is automatically driving the price, it changes. And right now, I don't see any, red king crab did have an inventory situation, but I don't see any indication that we have an inventory situation with Dungeness crab. And the main reason is I don't see any price weakness. I mean, the prices of what's available has been very stable. Retail and food service will expand the demand if it's there, if the supply is there, and China's a strong market. So here's some price comparisons that we can that we can look at. So these are whole cooks, and here's where we jumped up. We came up here, and so this has been very stable. Sorry, that's not whole cook. That is a whole cook. These are percentage increases. They're not dollar prices. So the whole cook percentage increase is about 30% over where it was a couple of years ago. This to this, a 30% increase. Sections haven't increased as much. These are sections because we started at a little bit higher price. We went down. We're about here, about 20% higher. Snow crab is 50% higher. That's this snow crab here compared to here. Lobster meat at its height was about 60% higher. So what I'm saying is that the commodities where you've had a big run-up in price, a 50 or 60% change in a relatively short time, are more vulnerable to a correction than the commodities like Dungeness, which have had less of a run-up in price. This is snow crab. I just wanted to show you. Here's lobster meat. Here is crab meat. Here is shrimp. That's just the commodity cycle in the last few years. And we look at snow crab up at the top of its cycle. And that's why I'm expecting some sort of price change in snow crab in 2018. These are, the next series of slides is just kind of analyzing some of the seasons with landings and volumes. Much higher landings in January than the year before. And what strikes me about this is that the late openings don't seem to have had a very negative impact on the market. Initially, a few years ago, I used to think that if we missed the Christmas market, missed the holiday market, it would kind of depress prices going forward. And I think that's changed. I think that what's happened is that the market will absorb January pricing. This is the ex-vessel price here. And you can see this is DOMOIC acid here and the sections here. But you can see that the volume, the timing of the volume seems to be okay. So even if there's a late opening this year, I don't think there's going to be a market impact of that. These are monthly landings by state. This is Washington, Oregon, and California. You can see what happened with California having a very delayed season last year. And you can also see the increase of the Washington and Oregon landings. And here's another slide that shows the same thing. The blue there is the November to January portion of, sorry, that's just November landings. And then you see the main season in California. And so they've had a big recovery in 2016 from where they were in 2015. On the coast wide, I wanted to look at what was the proportion of landings in November, December, January versus for each state. And these are, again, without California. But then last year, once we had California back, we had, 40 million pounds landed in those first 3 months. If we look at the entire season, in other words, from whenever the season opens until April, May, June, as those little bit of landings dribble in. What this shows me, at least, is that the proportion, this is what's landed in the November to January period, and this is what's landed in the rest of the season, and that's coast-wide. And what we can see is that in the last couple of years, there's been more volume that's been available to buyers later on into the season. in February and March, for example, than has happened in the past. I don't know the reasons for that. I know that that is supporting some of the live sales, and that when those landings are still coming in, it'll definitely allow you to make deals with buyers and so forth. This one here is Oregon price and volume in 2017. Here's the pricing during the high volume season. And then as the volumes dwindle, obviously the price goes up. And most of this pricing is supported by the live market, obviously, whereas the prior heavy landing volumes go into the frozen market. This is 3 years of that same chart, and I want to show you here. Here's the pricing of 2017. Here's 2016 season. This was fall of 16, January 2017, fall of 15, 2016, and fall of 14 and 15 and 16. So the pattern is similar, and basically when you have a high volume of landings coming in, the price has to adjust because it's going to different markets than when you have those small landings coming in at the end of the season. We know there's three segments: the clusters, whole cook, and live. The volume and demand for the frozen products and the fresh whole cooks determines the initial pricing. And this, I think, is something that happens if domoic acid suppresses demand for whole cooks. People don't want to take the risk with a whole crab. It does increase the interest in sections. And then once the sort of bulk of the season has passed, the new orders and the live and fresh demand determines the pricing. But it's all heavily dependent on the pace of landings. So if the pace of landings is slow for any reason, the prices are going to shoot up in response to that, because there'll be more people scrambling to get the available product. This just shows the annual pricing. This goes back to what I was talking about the overall increase in value. You can see that in the last few years, we're basically at a higher level, very similar to what we saw with snow crab. We're basically valuing Dungeness at a higher range than what we were a few years ago. And this is 2017, and you can see that I think that there's room to move up here, given the rest of the crab market. This is live import prices. This is Canada. This is actually 3 types of prices here. This is whole cooks here. You can see that they're above where they were before. This is sections. You can see sections has kind of drifted down a little bit. And this is live crab to Canada. And this decline here, I think, is something that more likely reflects the weakening of the Canadian currency than necessarily changing in the U.S. Dollar value. In other words, as the U.S. dollar gets stronger in relation to Canada, Canadians have to pay less. It's more expensive for Canadians to buy crab, but the U.S. dollar value is less. If we look at the comparison with king crab and snow crab, this is red king crab. As you've seen in all those commodity things, red king crab is definitely on a lower price trajectory. This season opened about $2 or $3 lower than last year. Here, this is Dungeness here, and then this is snow crab. And that's where I've been talking about our discrepancy, because most of the time, Dungeness pricing has been, well, actually, there's more to this here. Sorry. This is whole cooks. And even whole cooks were priced higher than Dungeness a few years ago. This is sections. And what we've had here is Dungeness snow crab is higher than sections as well. So we see that over this last couple of years, as these section prices have come down, DOMOIC acid here and lower market value here, the snow crab prices has shot up. Now, I want to say something about this, which is that the snow crab market was very, very surprising this year. We didn't necessarily expect it to have the price strength that it did. And I think I'll get into that a little bit later. Let me just go through some of these product forms. We all know the product forms here. But in the lower volume period, the live buyers set the price. In high volume, the live market is filled. It can only take so much. There's only so many restaurants in LA equipped to handle live Dungeness. There's only so much Chinese air freight capacity. And once you've gone beyond that, you got to do something with the crab other than sell it live. China, exports to China have really helped the market. You can see here, this is U.S. exports to China, and this is Canadian exports to China. This is U.S. exports to China, and that's a U.S. export price. And for live crab. Whole cooks can move volume, but it's not necessarily a profitable item. We've discussed this in other years. There's some drip loss from the cooking, but you cannot sell it at too much of a premium over the live price. Frozen sections and frozen whole cooks. We talked about the prices being less than snow crab, and we talked about how the market has expanded. Here's another price graph of sections and whole cooks and snow crab, and I guess this is a duplicate of what I showed earlier. I didn't delete this slide. Crab meat's very important, and a lot of that is picked here in the U.S. By specialized plants. Not everybody can do that, but the ability to have this crab meat is very important as a food service item because it goes into your Dungeness salads and so forth. So this is what I was referring to with snow crab. I totally misread the snow. I give a lot of presentations in Eastern Canada prior to the season. And I went up there thinking that the U.S. buyers at the Boston Seafood Show had said they were going to cut back purchases by 40% if their prices were over $7. And certain people up in Canada were trying to establish prices around $7, and the market just blew through that 100%. And the prices at the beginning of the season, once the Japanese started getting in there and making their contracts, were more at the $7.85 level, and that was very close to what the Alaska snow crab had sold at. Historically, there's always been a difference between the Alaska and Canadian snow crab, but in recent years, that's largely been erased. We are also, the other reason I was expecting some adjustment on snow crab prices was because the Gulf of St. Lawrence had the biggest crab fishery they've ever had in their history, about 38,000 to 40,000 tons, whereas in a normal year, they're at the 18 to 25,000 level. So we had all of this additional crab coming into the market from the Gulf. We had U.S. buyers who were saying they were going to back away, and I put those two together and thought the prices were going to fall, and they did the opposite. So why did they do so? Well, Japan was the real driver here. What happened with Japan is that in recent years, the Japanese, I think, well, we'll get to this in some slides, I'm gonna go right, we've seen this, I'm gonna go right here. In recent years, the Japanese have seen the volume of snow crab that they use go down, down, down. And they've got to a very low level. And it used to be that they would say it was too expensive to compete with the US buyers. But they finally two things happened. The economy began to improve in Japan. And in the last year or two, they've literally had the best economic situation that they've had there in 10 or 12 years. And they decided that they could sell more snow crab, and they were going to pay whatever it took to get that snow crab. So in Canada and Newfoundland, the Japanese increased their buying by 40%, increased their market share, even though the total volume of crab in Newfoundland fell by 23%. So it's an example of a really ferocious competition. And so what that meant was that the packers in Newfoundland could get these $7.85 prices from the Japanese right from the get-go of the season. And even if the US buyers would never have initially agreed to that price, once that price was set, they took it because there wasn't that much other crab available. So it was like the Japanese were first in line. They packed everything they needed to their specifications. And then what was left over was available to the US market, and they were short. And so all of a sudden the US guys started bidding up the price as well. So in my mind, it was the Japanese that made that change, and that's what was unexpected. And I think the Japanese are likely to be strong buyers of crab again in 2018. So they are helping to support this higher price. Now, the Japanese are not big buyers of Dungeness, but the ricochet or the knock-on effect is that the Japanese demand is definitely keeping snow crab prices high in the US. And so that's making the Dungeness price more competitive and potentially able to go higher. Now, snow crab, these shortages are not going to get better. This is the Alaska tack in Opelio, and you can see now there is some thought that this is probably bottoming out and that we should see some increases in Alaska. There was a lot of smaller crab in the survey that hadn't recruited to the fishery, and if that crab survives, we're going to see some sort of bounce back on the Alaska Opelio. But we don't know the pace of it, and there's no guarantee that it could just be a very, very slow increase. Canada is in trouble. I mean, Canada, the snow crab, they're changing the ecosystem. And the survey in Newfoundland, they won't announce the figures till March, but the preliminary survey results are pretty bad. And so they had a cut of about 23% last year. They're likely to be down again. And in Newfoundland, at least, they didn't even catch the quota because it was too hard to find crab. So on the Gulf, that was a one-year phenomenon when they went up to 40,000 tons. And this year, they're going to drop back down to about 25,000 tons, which is a good year for them. So basically, if you look at snow crab and think on a national level that snow crab is the primary competitor for Dungeness, snow crab is going to be short. So that's where there's a market opportunity. This is just the US supply imports, Alaska, this is 2016. In 2017, it's going to decrease further. Alaska's down and the US imports are down a little bit. Japan has stabilized. It'll increase a little bit in 2017, but they're not going to go any lower than where they are right now, and they're going to start increasing. Yeah.
What I've seen with all this stuff here, not many slides ago, you were talking about how you expect the snow crab to kind of fall off.
Yes, that.
You know, if there's less product, this Japanese are buying 40% less, why would we see a decline? Why would we see more stable prices?
That's a really good point. And I think that, in fact, I wanted to bring that up because if you look at things like these commodity markets, they can stay high for much longer than you think. And even though I look at all these other prices like shrimp and crab meat and lobster meat and so forth that have, and red king crab, which have come down, if you look at cold water shrimp, for example, cold water shrimp is an example of something where the price began to decline, and then people thought there were shortages that shot the price up. Then they thought they overshot, so the prices began to decline a little bit, and then they shot up again because the supply matched with the demand. And so with snow crab, this coming year, it depends on external market factors. If it was up to the U.S. alone, the U.S. buyers would not support that price. If those external market factors are there, principally Japan, and the Japanese want to repeat the amount of snow crab that they bought with a declining supply, then they will keep those prices up where they are.
So they could easily just maintain flat.
Yeah, they could. They could, very much so. Yeah, absolutely, right.
I don't know, but
yeah.
do you want questions as we go, or do you want to wait till the end?
We're almost done. Let's just
Fair enough.
wait till the end here. I just want to point out Barents Sea. The Barents Sea crab is going more towards Asia than it is to the U.S. The amount of crab from the Barents Sea, this is snow crab, it declined in 2017. Part of that is because Russia, we were getting, this is mostly in the Russian area here. You know, Russia and Norway kind of split this, and a lot of the crabs in Russia, and we were getting some fishing from some Latvian crab boats that were financed by people in Seattle, and Russia kicked those out of the zone in 2017, and so we haven't gotten anything from Latvia or Lithuania. Red king crab, I mentioned this, the market's coming down. The new season, last year their fishing price was they started at about $10.48. This year it's a couple of dollars below that. The CNF sales to Japan, about $17. They were about $19.75 last year. The US price, $16.50 to $17.50, depending on the size, and that was $19.50 to $20 last year. So what people say happened is that the market kind of died in January in reaction to the high prices, and they've been kind of sluggish all year. So people, the processors, even though the red king crab supply declined again by about 15% to probably 8 million pounds or less, the packers were still very reluctant to put up the product, and so the price came down. But this goes back to our snow crab discussion. Not likely to change, but it could stay at its same plateau. Dungeness is on a different cycle. We talked about the per capita consumption of crab. The figures, frankly, just came out this morning. And for crab consumption, I think it was from 0.56 to 0.55. It was pretty much insignificant change in per capita consumption. That's all crab. And it's more supply driven than anything else. But what it means is that we're in kind of a stable situation with usage of crab in the U.S. It's better positioned. I obviously have been sounding this whole talk. And there's still little unsold crab on the market. I think the red lobster promotion was significant. The distortion is still a threat, but I think it's less of a threat than in other years. When it first happened a couple of years ago and we had that big California closure, kind of shocked a lot of buyers. Now it's become more of an issue that people live with. And so even if there are delays due to domoic acid, I don't think they're going to have as big a market impact as they had a couple of years ago. You know, we saw when there was those closures, customers really wanted to get the crab from open areas, even if it was tribal areas in Washington or wherever. They would just try to get some crab to get something in their products. So any effects this year will be less than prior years. The positives, we've discussed a lot of these. A low volume year is going to have a big impact on Dungeness prices. Dungeness is, as I said, it's already favorably priced in relation to other products. Low volume will push that back onto the West Coast at a higher price. Last year, this is a quote, 2017 could see another record for value with an increase in landings and relatively small decline in price. And that bore out. That was correct. And I think that with a higher price this year and good volume, would see a record for a third year. But if we have lower volume, we might not be able to achieve that. So volume is really the wild card here. There are a lot of reasons for prices to rise. I've been going through those. How much they go up might depend on the volume. Obviously, low volume would push them up higher. If volumes are similar to last year, I think that customers for Dungeness will absorb a higher price because there'll be a narrowing of the spread in the other crab markets. I think that there's some potential there. Snow crab shortages are likely in 2018. So one of the things I look for, this is almost the last slide, I think there's one or two more, is when a market's expanded, customers, they tend to keep wanting to buy something they've been successful with. And so the fact that people were successful with Dungeness clusters this year on the frozen side means that those guys are looking to repeat what they did next year. Now, if they come in and the supply is there, they'll be happy to repeat it. But if they come in and the supply is not there, all of a sudden it quickly pushes up the price because too many of these buying programs are already locked in on some sort of inertia, and they say, well, we were going to have Dungeness on our menu and we got to have it, so if it costs more initially, we're still going to follow that price move. So any contraction of supply here after you've expanded all that usage is going to have a price reaction. In terms of triggers, the crab market strength, I think, currently depends on Japan and China. If the Japanese, for let's say something happens, there's tensions with North Korea, people start not buying crab the way they have been, and we depended only on the US market, prices would be significantly lower than otherwise. So I think it's very positive for 2018. I think that we've been kind of on a trajectory that's been very, very healthy. And I think it's a particularly healthy trajectory for Dungeness. I do think that there's risks. You can never, be certain that everything's going to work out. But overall, in my mind, this is a more positive outlook than I've had in a while for Dungeness. So thanks. And now we can have this discussion. Thank you. Dave, did you have a...
Well, yeah, we could probably do this one because last year when we went into the season, we were thinking that Dungeness was going to be right there with snow crab, around $8. I think we were kind of looking at that. When most of the sections and the promotions went on were $7. So if that's the case, and say that the volume's the same, just showing that kind of stability, you've got the red lobster that put it on, but what's going to make them want to pay more than what they paid last year? And when they ran a promotion, how big was the promotion that they ran, and was it as successful as what you were saying? But right now the market's just above $7 with no volume, so that's that's kind of, I don't know how you're seeing that Dungeness is gonna go up another 20% there. And also the frozen poultry market is down, it hasn't. You showed those both up, and actually they were down from last year. That being said, another question that I've got to Hugh, because Hugh said, well, it's gonna be a down year. What's your number?
Well,
If you say something to John, let the audience know
sure.
what your volume levels.
Yeah, I've been, all I've told John and everybody else is, we've been doing a study for 12 years with Dr. Alan James. He's got a 12% plus or minus accuracy. Last year he predicted 20,400,000 for Oregon, and we got 20,040,000. So he was pretty close. This next year he's predicting 10 million.
What is your prediction? You're saying it's gonna be lower.
Right, so I'm just, you're really telling you what he says, 10 million. So I think it's gonna be, personally, my opinion is between 10 and 14.
Good.
Let me answer those in two questions. You're right, Dave, about snow crab pricing. At this time last year, I definitely thought snow crab prices, the ceiling was about $7. And with Dungeness expected to trade at sort of a higher level than snow crab, it seemed like the market was kind of in balance. But I was surprised at the strength of the snow crab market, including what the U.S. buyers were paying, because even though the Japanese kind of pushed the market up, it didn't retreat once the Japanese had sort of taken their snow crab. And U.S. buyers were paying $7.75, $7.85, $8, $8.10. For Gulf crab, the crab fishermen, the Canadian fishermen in the Gulf, were getting $5 a pound for their snow crab. And this is a very Canadian now, not U.S. This is Canadian dollars, you know. But there was a very, very strong crab market based on, I think, some of these adjustments. So this year, I don't see that snow crab price. I agree with this comment here. I don't see that snow crab price necessarily changing a lot because of the supply cutbacks on snow crab and because of these external factors like Japan. I think that the Dungeness price has historically been at a higher level than snow crab. And so even if the snow crab comes down to a 750, 725, 750 range, in my viewpoint, if the buyers revert, especially if there's less volumes, it'll quickly push the price up higher than snow crab.
I was just surprised that it never really did come back up.
I was.
Stayed down. That's surprising.
Well, one other thing about snow crab I forgot to mention is they had a very slow start to the season. They had a lot of ice problems. And so instead of a big slug of crab all at once that also can depress pricing, plants were struggling to get supply and fill their contracts. And so it was a much more even period of landings because as the ice improved, they would be getting more landings and so forth. And that helped keep the price up in Canada.
And my only other comment that I was going to make was, I think with DOMOIC acid, I just don't think that, you mentioned that you thought that the folks it's not going to be as hard felt because we're used to it now, we're doing the right for food safety, but I still think that perception when it gets out there just isn't a healthy thing, and I do believe that it plays with the market. So we're really hoping that does clean up because I do believe it has an effect.
John, as you all know, we don't really have control over exactly when the season opens because of different issues, DOMOIC acid or refill. That being said, I guess my takeaway, maybe Scott can help me a little with this. The holiday season really is kind of important, and it really promotes the product well on the West Coast, and it allows inventory to move out ahead of what's being put in the freezer, and it's important for that reason. Plus, it extends the selling season out, right? So longer selling season. I think there is real importance to it. It allows, cash flow, processor level, and a really super good product going out to the public on the West Coast. You know, I think even though from year to year maybe it doesn't affect the value over time, and kind of looking at the big picture, it is somewhat important to get crab for the holiday market.
I agree, it's important to have the additional sales, but as often happens when you're in a more short supply situation, and I'm talking the crab market overall, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, it's obvious that more people are wanting to buy crab and the crab values are higher. And that's the perspective that I'm coming from. When the crab values are lower and you have, like, let's say, more supply than the market can absorb, then missing a December holiday can be very more important because you're sort of just trying to get the crab out through the market. But the last few years, we have been in a situation where it's been short. I mean, you experienced it here a few years ago very severely. And it's been 2 years now for snow crab. It was last year for king crab when prices went up to $20. And so for some reason, there's not enough crab around for the people who want to buy it. And that's the perspective in which I was looking at the holiday market. Other years, you might not have the chance to recover. But
And it pushes the whole production with time. The selling season's really not that good.
Right.
For like an ex-vessel value price, it can be, it feels like it can be, have an effect, you know, especially if we all get bunched up and delayed.
right. Well, you have Chinese New Year. That helps.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, what is your take on Japanese buyers being interested in Dungeness crab in the future when they're looking at pricing being equal par value? The Japanese have very, very particular product needs. And so, you know, on snow crab, for example, a lot of the crab legs they use that Maris section in sushi, and it fits right on a little, and they also use it in shabu shabu, where they score the snow crab, or they take the shell off and the meat is raw, and they dip it in the boiling broth and so forth. And so there's very specific product forms which drives the Japanese usage of crab. So in order for Dungeness, in my opinion, in order for Dungeness to get into that market, we'd have to find a product form that the Japanese would like. And I think that that's hard to do. I think that the Chinese are a much more viable market for frozen crab because in other species that start out live, that's kind of the high end of the market, the frozen market tends to fill in behind that. So if you look at Canadian lobster, all the excitement is about live lobster, but Canadians are now selling about half the volume of live as frozen. And it's going in as frozen lobsters to China now. And that's something that wasn't there a couple of years ago. And I think that these e-commerce sites and things like that are a sales channel that is really, really hungry for product. So hungry for product, they're going out and buying up companies in Eastern Canada. They're working with a company in Adak off Alaska to just supply live king crab into that Chinese market. And so I think that the potential to bleed over in China into a frozen Dungeness market is something I would see as very high. Yeah.
You said that Japanese were pretty particular about how their crab come. Are the Canadians selling snow crab in a different product form other than sections?
They sell it raw. They sell
Is it live?
No, they don't sell. Snow crab's very hard to sell live unless it's delivered directly from the boat because it
That's
doesn't.
what I was wondering. I mean,
Yeah.
I think Dungeness has considerably more product forms than snow crab does. Why would that not be something they would be interested in?
Oh, because of the type of product form. In other words,
They sell it raw, John? Raw frozen or raw frozen?
Raw frozen, yeah.
Raw frozen?
They
Raw
butchered
frozen.
it in sections and just never cooked it.
I didn't know that.
Well, they sell a raw whole crab frozen, and they do sell some raw frozen sections. That's
So
true.
how's that different than a live crab? You think the Japanese they're stickler about their
Well,
product?
it's
Live
about
crab.
the-
Yeah, but the,
What the product form is the dungy section leg is about yay long,
Yeah.
and that don't fit on a sushi roll. You know, that don't fit on a,
I've got
in
them on
their, in their.
Oregon
So they're talking about that longer leg section fitting their, what they like to eat on their menu.
and the live crab, you don't buy live snow crab in Japan. Where the Japanese used the live crab was they used to have many, many crab plants in Hokkaido that would unload these illegal vessels from Russia. And then they would cook and process and, or freeze the crab raw. They don't, like in China with Dungeness, you see the live crab in the tanks. You see live king crab, you see live Dungeness, you see brown crab from the UK, and you see lobster, all in their live tanks. And all of those are sort of bleeding into the frozen market. Yeah.
John, been to Japan a few times, but I'm not on the marketing side, I'm on the processing side. But that being said, it seems to me that the Dungeness crab, when we were over there this last February, they were pretty much, they really shy away, and I think some of it's the color. I think it's not the red, it's more of a purple meat. I think they want that red color too.
Well, snow crab, there's a fishery in Japan in the central part of the country that has a native Apelio crab that looks exactly like the crab in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And that's why the Japanese have always preferred the Gulf of St. Lawrence crab. And they even have like these crab tour buses. I mean, they get a bunch of people on a bus and take them out and they visit crab restaurants every day and they're served these, big live crabs. And it's a cultural thing, yeah.
So in one of the slides there where we talked about consumer support, the consumer sentiment support is down 20% from 06, 07. Do you think that is basically from the 09 crash in the economy, or do you think that might be population driven, the baby boomers, age
I think it's supply driven because remember in 2004, 2005, we had this big surge of illegal king crab from Russia, global fisheries, millions of pounds really. And there was just you could get, king crab, 3 pounds of king crab at Legal Seafood's restaurant for $30. And there was just a huge volume of crab those years. And I think that's what the consumption, that's what drives those consumption numbers. And I think that what you could see is that those per capita consumption has been fairly consistent, but the prices have gone up. It means that people are sticking with crab even as prices rise somewhat.
John, if you saw similar volumes to last year, what would you predict for a price?
I think it should go up, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. And the reason is that I think that, like I said, I think that in a global sense, I think the crab market is short. And that may not translate down to every single product form. But if there's good volumes for Dungeness, there's ways to expand it outside the West Coast at slightly higher prices than last year, in my opinion.
So we're benefiting from the market growing, from
Right.
the volume demand.
Yeah.
So Dungeness historically has been very popular in China. Do you see any other species of crab that gain more and more the popularity in China, other than Dungeness?
King crab. Because the Chinese are beginning to take more of the Russian king crab. And that can compete with Japan.
Not the brown crab?
Brown crab from the UK, I don't know too much about the volumes, but that's very similar to Dungeness. At least it looks similar to me.
It sounds like brown crab is sold with caviar fish or crab eggs, and Chinese consumers really like
Okay, I'm not that familiar with molting, so I don't know, the UK fishery, I don't know much about it. I've just seen them in China, that's all. And they seem to be pretty widely represented. Yeah.
What I've seen all this year is that with any form that we do Dungeness in, whether it be whole cook or meat or sections, it's all kind of been a flat line for a year. Okay, nothing's gone up very much. It's kind of stayed there. And I think there is some stuff in the future with China, with the frozen, not so much with the Japanese, because they've got to relate to what they're eating, okay? But nothing's changed so far in the market for Dungeness as far as if I was going to sell it to try to get more money because I wanted to keep the product flowing, right? So it is very important this year as to what we're going to get as far as production. You know, some guys think it's 10, some guys think it's 14, some a little more. I think it's going to be real important as to what in the ocean and how we're going to pay so much for this product.
One thing about the pricing is that because of the concentration of landings, in the first 2 months of the season, once those crab are in the plant, there's very little, and there isn't any reason to change the pricing on the customer wholesale side because, people enter into contracts, they enter into you have it on your price list, your cost is already in the product. So there's very little reason to change the price once it's in the freezer, unless there's some very dramatic change in the market and like you have way less than what your customers want, or you have way more. But if it's around what you're thinking of, the price stability is really helpful. And if that price is set correctly at the beginning of the season, in a sense that's going to flow through, it makes the rest of the month's sales much better than if you're being volatile, going up and down month to month.
Just there's no higher price out there. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that I know most of the guys that fish, they all want more money. Let's face it.
But you got more money. Look at the last 3 years.
We do, but there's nothing there yet to make that price go up.
Well, it has gone up. I have to disagree with that because if you look at the last 8 or 10 years, the last 4 or 5 years, we've definitely gotten higher prices than we had the previous 4 or 5 years. And I think that's in every single crab fishery I've looked at. I think that's true.
It looks like the market has stabilized there too, in my mind. I mean, we haven't seen any big.
Yeah,
It looks like we're going to see any big problems.
yeah. So I think that there might be some niche products that could, but it's, when you think about Dungeness, what could you do to get more money for Dungeness? That's independent of supply. I mean, what's the product for? I mean, sometimes the price of a product has to do with how it's packed. Like in snow crab, there are these individual gas frozen, nitrogen frozen crab legs. They look beautiful, and it's a really premium product, and it's a higher price. And the fishermen get about 25 cents more for landing the product that goes into that thing. But it's very hard to do profitably, and the size of that sort of premium Japanese gift box market has been shrinking and shrinking. There are people who, with king crab, tried to sell individual crab legs and sort of get a higher price by cutting the crab at the time it was cooked and getting away from some of the broken legs and so forth. And they were trying to get a 10% premium, and they didn't. That company went under too. So I just think there's, maybe there's a creative product development or marketing, but I think it's a wild product. It's going to have variability, and it's, I think the value comes from people wanting it in its present form.
Yeah, they're doing better at all that, John. The snow crab pack, the Dungeness pack, the section pack, actually better. They figured out how to pack and glaze it better.
Right.
Snow crab, 15 years ago, coming out of Alaska,
It was
terrible.
junk.
It was junk.
Yeah.
It's good now.
Well, I think that's wild seafood in general. People have been handling it better and learning how to preserve the value of better. I think that's absolutely right.
You know, you've got to mention Joe's Crab Shack, and how many millions of pounds do you think they use a year? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's gone down significantly, wouldn't you think, because of the closing stores and sold to a new buyer and whatnot. Who is the new buyer? Is that the bank?
Who's buying it?
Yeah.
I think it's I think it's the guy who owns Rainforest and all those other things, Tillman Fertet or whatever, the Houston guy.
Hasn't Red Lobster kind of picked up here in the last few years? They never were Dungeness buyers 7, 8 years ago,
Right.
I remember, so now they're kind of a new player.
They are.
Right.
Right. But all these restaurant industry, they are having problems because they're overextended. They built too many restaurants. And so it's not a zero-sum game. When Joe's Crab Shack closes these 30 locations, the people who used to go there to eat crab are still going to go to other places. And they're still going to eat crab to some extent in other restaurants as well. And so I think there was a kind of disconnect in my mind between all of this doom and gloom in the food service sector and the sense that seafood prices have really ticked up because all of a sudden food service is the main play instead of retail. After 2009, for 5 years it was retail. And the last couple of years, in my mind, it's been food service has been a really attractive market. And I'm not sure exactly why. I think people like to eat seafood. They depend on the traffic. But I think that this makes the restaurants very price sensitive. But at the same time, they're kind of locked in, like Red Lobster, locked into getting products that their customers want. And so, so they're going to always have crab on the menu, even when they have to pay for it. They even bought red king crab at $20, even if it wasn't much of a volume, but they bought some. And so they're kind of locked in.
You know, a lot of the major buyers of crab got it off the menu because the price got so high. This last year, I saw more restaurants put it back on the menu, but it's because we had a level price,
Right.
and they could do that. So it just worries, I mean, that's why the supply is so important. It worries me because we get it too high, and then we lose customers, right? And we can't, I know you can think out of the box and put the new forms, but we don't have that yet. We don't have that market ready. So it's just, I guess what I'm trying to say is that with a higher supply, you got to be careful what you pay because you might lose what you have.
Oh, I think that's no question about it.
I don't want to lose what I got.
Yes, but I think that you can, in other years, I've talked about that a lot, about scaring off the buyers. And I have to say, I'm a little bit, I'm kind of reacting to last year's snow crab market because I thought that's what was going to happen. And I thought that the Alaska $8 price on Apelio in last January was a fluke, and that the Canadians were going to come in at around the $7 level, and we're going to have a good year, but at this lower level of prices. And the market didn't play out that way. And so, and it's made me think that there's a stronger level of demand for crab than what might appear on the surface. And so, yes, we talk about losing these restaurant buyers and going off the menu, but there's a countervailing issue there, which is that people have more money to spend, and crab is one of the things they want to spend money on. So, yeah.
So going back to those market dynamics, looking at the casino industry in general, moving away from the high-priced crab and looking at a lower-priced product or a more affordable type product, what do you think would need to be done to get Dungeness crab into that marketplace?
I'm not sure how many casinos sell whole cooks. And I'm not sure that that's a buffet item.
How about the
Certainly,
sections?
certainly sections are.
Well, I know sections are, but the question was, how would you get into more casinos?
I think it's growing myself personally. I mean, I'm not a gambler, but I've been to quite a few small casinos on the west coast here, and they are trending to have sections in their on buffets.
Yeah, I think the casinos have always been crab buyers, and I think that there's a good entree for Dungeness.
But what I'm saying
sections,
is,
yeah.
smaller casinos now, these little local Indian tribes,
Yeah.
even the one in Coos Bay for crying out loud, you go in there at Christmas time or Thanksgiving, they have sections on their buffets. They've never had that before.
Right. No, I think that's true, but the question is, how could you expand that? And I think that a product that you don't
Well,
see.
even expanding it into the Gulf Coast states, I mean,
Well,
you've got
those-
Indian
those-
casinos and, I mean,
Yeah, but the two main buyers of Canadian snow crab are the all-you-can-eat buffet, Asian buffet restaurants in the South, and a lot of these Gulf Coast casinos. And the fact that they're pulling back is very much an opportunity for them to try Dungeness if the supply is available. Now, they're not going to buy it at $9. I mean, we got to be realistic here. But at the $7.50 for sections, that is something that would be attractive to them.
You said already, there's probably a higher demand than what we have product for at
Right,
this point.
right.
Right.
Is it fair to, did I interpret your information correctly that the imports from China have remained steady over the last 3 years?
Steady over the last two. I think they grew. I think in 2015 they came up. In 2016 they're about the same. In 2017 about the same for Dungeness.
Is it fair to say that the DOMOIC acid coverage or scare, if you will, is affecting them less than we would have predicted?
The Chinese are very skittish, and so they had a cadmium problem where they claimed there's elevated levels of cadmium, and they shut down for a week or so. Well, that was Disney. Korea is another big crab market, very sensitive to radiation around Fukushima and stuff like that. So I don't know to what extent there's consumer awareness or something like that, but it would be a very negative factor. So far, I think most of these have been at the customs and border level, and also at the Canadian customs level in Vancouver, as to whether something passes Canadian export controls.
But it hasn't had a huge effect yet.
No, hasn't had an effect yet.
Sean, what's the cadmium thing?
Cadmium?
Yeah, what do you know about that?
Byproduct of gold mining, right?
yeah, I was gonna say, my understanding in what articles I could read was it was a Canadian problem.
There was one place in Washington State that had a former, some kind of factory or some mine. There's a particular bay that had elevated levels of cadmium, and they got a couple of crab from there and got tested above the level, and they had to go back to the Chinese and explain how they weren't going to ship that out of that bay anymore or something